Hi there, and welcome back. It's great to have you here again. Today's story is about Sisyphus, the clever king who tried to cheat death itself, only to end up with one of the most famous punishments in all of mythology. I won't keep you any longer. Sit back, relax, enjoy, and have fun. Part 1. The king who thought he was smarter than the gods. In the age when gods walked among mortals and divine intervention shaped the course of human affairs, there lived a man whose name would become forever synonymous with cunning, defiance, and ultimately eternal punishment. This was Sisyphus, king of Corinth, one of the wealthiest and most strategically important cities in ancient Greece, a man whose intelligence and capacity for manipulation were so extraordinary that he became both celebrated and feared throughout the known world. Sisyphus was not born to greatness, but rather seized it through his wits, ascending to the throne of Corinth through a combination of political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and clever manipulation of circumstances that would have destroyed lesser men. His reputation as a master of deception and strategy spread far beyond the borders of his kingdom, and rulers from distant lands would seek his counsel or fear his schemes, never quite certain whether he was offering genuine friendship or simply positioning them as pieces in some larger game only he could see. He was a man of remarkable talents, a silver-tongued orator who could convince almost anyone of almost anything, a strategic thinker who could see 10 moves ahead in any political situation, and a shameless opportunist who recognized that rules and conventions were merely obstacles to be circumvented by those clever enough to find the loopholes. Under his rule, Corinth prospered materially, growing wealthy through trade and becoming a center of commerce that connected the Peloponnese with the Greek mainland. But this prosperity came at a moral cost, for Sisyphus built his success on a foundation of lies, betrayals, and manipulations that would eventually draw the attention and wrath of powers far greater than any mortal king. What distinguished Sisyphus from other clever rulers and cunning politicians was not merely the degree of his intelligence or the extent of his ambition, but rather the scope of his arrogance and the targets he chose for his deceptions. Many kings lied to their subjects or betrayed their allies. Many politicians manipulated circumstances for personal gain. Many merchants cheated their customers or competitors, but Sisyphus was not content to limit his schemes to the mortal realm. He looked at the gods themselves, those immortal beings who supposedly governed all aspects of existence with absolute power and perfect knowledge, and he saw not omnipotent deities to be worshipped and feared, but rather powerful beings who could potentially be outwitted and manipulated just like any other political opponent. But Sisyphus, for all his intelligence, seemed incapable of recognizing the danger of his position, or perhaps simply believed that he was so clever that he could escape any consequences the gods might devise. He had spent his entire life proving that he was smarter than everyone around him, that no trap could hold him, and no scheme could outwit him. And he had internalized this success to the point where he genuinely believed that intelligence itself was the supreme power in the universe, superior even to divine authority. He looked at the gods and saw beings who, despite their immortality and supernatural abilities, were subject to the same emotions and weaknesses as mortals. They could be flattered, manipulated, deceived, and played against one another. Zeus, for all his power, was constantly distracted by romantic entanglements and could be maneuvered through appeals to his pride. Hera could be played against Zeus through her jealousy. Poseidon and Apollo and the other Olympians all had their own interests and rivalries that a clever mortal might exploit. The gods, Sisyphus believed, were not truly omniscient or omnipotent, but rather simply very powerful beings with very long lifespans, and a mortal of sufficient intelligence could match wits with them and potentially even come out ahead. This philosophy, this fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between mortal and divine, between human cleverness and cosmic order, would prove to be Sisyphus's fatal flaw. He had built his entire identity around being the smartest person in any situation, around outsmarting everyone he encountered, and he could not conceive of a problem that intelligence alone could not solve, or an opponent that cunning could not defeat. The idea that some powers transcended cleverness, that some forces in the universe operated according to principles that could not be manipulated or negotiated, that there might be consequences that no amount of fast talking or strategic thinking could avoid, these possibilities simply did not fit into Sisyphus's worldview. And so he continued his schemes and manipulations, growing bolder with each success, extending his reach further into realms that mortals were meant to respect and fear, until finally he committed an act of betrayal so egregious that it could not be overlooked or forgiven, an offense against Zeus himself that would set in motion the series of events leading to his eternal punishment. But even as his fate began to close around him, even as the gods turned their attention to this arrogant mortal who dared to treat them as mere players in his games, Sisyphus remained confident in his ability to talk or trick or scheme his way out of any predicament, still believing that intelligence would prove superior to power, that cleverness could defeat the divine, and that he, Sisyphus of Corinth, was the one mortal in all of history who truly could not be beaten at the game of manipulation and deception.
Part 2. The secret he should never have revealed. The incident that finally drew the full wrath of Zeus on Sisyphus involved the king of the gods' romantic entanglements, a subject that was perpetually troublesome for Olympus, given Zeus's insatiable appetite for mortal women and his willingness to pursue them regardless of the complications this created with his wife Hera or with the mortal families involved. On one particular occasion, Zeus had become infatuated with Aegina, a beautiful river nymph who was the daughter of the river god Asopus. Zeus, employing the kind of deception he frequently used in such matters, had spirited Aegina away to a secret location where he could pursue his desires without immediate interference from her father or from Hera. When Aegina disappeared, Asopus was frantic with worry and anger, searching everywhere for his missing daughter and questioning anyone who might have information about her whereabouts. The river god's search eventually brought him to Corinth, where he encountered King Sisyphus. And here is where a wise man, a pious man, a man who understood the proper boundaries between mortal and divine, would have pleaded ignorance or gently suggested that Asopus direct his inquiries to the gods themselves. But Sisyphus was none of these things. and when he realized that he possessed information that Asopus desperately wanted, he immediately saw an opportunity for personal gain. Sisyphus had, through his network of informants and his own careful observation, discovered the truth about Zeus's affair with Aegina and the location where the god had hidden her. This knowledge was extraordinarily dangerous, for it made Sisyphus a witness to Zeus's infidelity and a potential revealer of secrets that the king of the gods would strongly prefer remained hidden. A prudent man would have kept this information to himself, would have recognized that becoming involved in Zeus's romantic affairs was likely to end badly, regardless of which side one supported. But Sisyphus, seeing Asopus's desperation and recognizing the river god's power and influence, decided that he could profit from this situation by trading the information for favors that would benefit Corinth and strengthen his own position. He approached Asopus with an offer. He would reveal the location of Aegina and the identity of her abductor, but in return, he wanted Asopus to create a spring of fresh water on the Acrocorinth, the fortress hill that dominated Corinth and that suffered from a chronic shortage of reliable water sources.
This was a valuable prize, for access to fresh water on the high ground would make the fortress virtually unassailable during sieges and would permanently solve one of Corinth's major strategic vulnerabilities. Asopus, desperate to recover his daughter and willing to promise almost anything in return for information, agreed to Sisyphus's terms. The river god used his divine powers to create a spring of fresh water on the Acrocorinth, a spring that would flow for centuries and that significantly enhanced Corinth's military and economic position. And in return, Sisyphus revealed everything he knew, that Zeus had abducted Aegina, that the king of the gods was hiding her on a remote island, and that the whole affair was being conducted in secret to avoid Hera's jealous rage. Armed with this information, Asopus immediately set out to confront Zeus and retrieve his daughter, leading to a confrontation between the river god and the king of Olympus that ended badly for Asopus, as such confrontations inevitably did, but which at least allowed him to locate and recover Aegina. Zeus, of course, quickly discovered who had betrayed his secret. The king of the gods was not merely annoyed or mildly offended, but rather filled with a rage that was both personal and political. On a personal level, Sisyphus had exposed Zeus's infidelity and created a situation that brought Hera's attention to yet another of his affairs, leading to the kind of domestic discord that even the king of the gods found tiresome. On a political level, Sisyphus had demonstrated a complete lack of respect for divine authority, treating the king of the gods not as a being to be worshipped and feared, but rather as a source of information to be exploited for mortal gain. This was intolerable, an example of hubris so profound that it could not be ignored without undermining Zeus's authority and encouraging other mortals to think they too could manipulate and betray the gods without consequence. Zeus decided that Sisyphus must be punished, and not with some minor inconvenience or temporary setback, but with death itself, with the ultimate removal from the mortal world and consignment to the underworld, where all mortals eventually ended up, but where Sisyphus would arrive ahead of his natural time as a direct consequence of his betrayal. To accomplish this, Zeus dispatched Thanatos, the personification of death itself, the grim figure who appeared at the appointed time to escort souls from the world of the living to the realm of Hades. Thanatos was not a god to be reasoned with or an opponent to be fought, but rather an inevitable force, the final ending that came to all mortals regardless of their wealth, power, or cleverness. When Thanatos arrived for you, your time was done, and resistance was not merely futile, but literally impossible. For death came to all and could not be denied or delayed by any mortal means. Or so everyone believed, until Thanatos encountered Sisyphus, the one mortal arrogant and clever enough to think that even death itself might be outsmarted. Part 3. Cheating Death for the First Time. When Thanatos arrived in Corinth to collect Sisyphus, the personification of death expected what he always experienced: a mortal acknowledging the inevitable, perhaps with fear or sadness or resignation, but ultimately accepting that their time had come and following him peacefully to the underworld. Some mortals begged for more time, some raged against their fate, some went quietly and with dignity, but all of them went because death was not a negotiation or a choice, but rather an absolute termination of mortal existence. Thanatos had collected countless souls over the eons, from the greatest heroes to the most humble peasants, and he had never encountered anyone who could resist him or delay his purpose for more than a few moments of futile protest. But Sisyphus had known that Zeus would eventually seek revenge for the betrayal, and he had been preparing for this moment, thinking through various scenarios and planning countermeasures for whatever punishment the gods might devise. When he learned that Thanatos was approaching Corinth, that death itself was coming to claim him, most mortals would have despaired. But Sisyphus saw this as simply another problem to be solved, another opponent to be outmaneuvered, and he set about devising a trap for the supposedly untrappable force of death. When Thanatos appeared before Sisyphus, the king greeted him not with fear, but with curiosity and a kind of false intellectual interest that immediately should have raised suspicions. Sisyphus appeared fascinated by Thanatos and his function, asking questions about how death worked, expressing admiration for the elegance and inevitability of the system, and showing particular interest in the chains that Thanatos carried, the mystical shackles that were used to bind souls and ensure they could not escape their fate. Thanatos, who rarely engaged in conversation with his charges, and who was not accustomed to being treated as a subject of intellectual inquiry, was somewhat taken aback by Sisyphus's approach. The personification of death explained, perhaps with a touch of pride in his role, that the chains were unbreakable and that once they were placed on a mortal, that mortal could not resist being led to the underworld. Sisyphus expressed skepticism, not challenging Thanatos directly, but rather suggesting with feigned innocence that surely such extraordinary claims required demonstration, that chains that were truly inescapable should be able to prove their power. He appealed to Thanatos's pride and his desire to be acknowledged as effective at his function, suggesting that a brief demonstration would settle any doubts and would actually make Sisyphus's eventual acceptance of death more willing and informed. This was manipulation of the subtlest and most dangerous kind, appealing to vanity and professional pride while disguising the trap in language of intellectual curiosity and reasonable skepticism. Thanatos, flattered by the attention and not perceiving any real threat from a mortal who would soon be bound regardless, agreed to demonstrate the chains. He showed Sisyphus how they worked, how they could be locked and secured, and in a fatal moment of lowered guard, he allowed himself to be positioned in a way that gave Sisyphus the opening he needed. With a speed and dexterity that must have shocked the personification of death, Sisyphus seized the chains and locked them around Thanatos himself, imprisoning death in his own inescapable shackles, trapping the trapper in a reversal that should have been impossible. The moment the chains closed around Thanatos, the balance of the entire world shifted in ways that were immediately and profoundly apparent. Death had been bound, and as long as Thanatos remained imprisoned, his function could not be performed. No living creature anywhere in the world could die, for death itself was chained in Sisyphus's palace, unable to perform his appointed task. The immediate effects were dramatic and disturbing. Warriors engaged in battles hacked at each other with swords and spears, inflicting terrible wounds that would normally be fatal. But the combatants could not die, could not escape the agony of their injuries, could only continue fighting or lie on the battlefield, suffering from wounds that should have killed them, but somehow left them conscious and in pain. Old people who had been ready to pass peacefully from the world found themselves lingering in bodies that were failing but could not complete their failure, trapped in states of extreme weakness or suffering, but unable to find the release that death should have provided. Animals that should have been slaughtered for food could not be killed, making it impossible to prepare meat. The natural cycle of life and death, the fundamental rhythm that governed all of existence, had been disrupted, and chaos began to spread as the implications became clear. Zeus watched this catastrophe unfold with mounting fury, for Sisyphus had not merely evaded his own punishment, but had somehow managed to break the entire cosmic order, to disrupt one of the most fundamental processes of existence. The mortal who had betrayed Zeus's secret was now sitting in his palace in Corinth, laughing at the gods and at death itself, reveling in the chaos he had created and in the proof of his own cleverness. He had done what no mortal in history had ever accomplished. He had trapped death itself, had brought the entire system of mortality to a halt, and had demonstrated that even the most fundamental forces of the universe could be manipulated by someone sufficiently clever and audacious. But Sisyphus's triumph, as complete as it seemed in that moment, was built on a fundamental misunderstanding that would eventually doom him. He had won a battle through cleverness, but he was engaged in a war against opponents who played by different rules and who had resources he could not match. The gods were not merely powerful mortals who could be permanently defeated through clever tricks, but rather immortal beings with infinite patience and the ability to escalate to levels of force and consequence that mortals could not imagine. Sisyphus's triumph over Thanatos would last for a time, creating the chaos he found so amusing, but it would ultimately bring upon him a response that even his considerable intelligence could not evade. Part 4. Ares unleashed and death set free. As the disruption caused by Thanatos's imprisonment continued, the effects rippled through both mortal and divine realms, creating disturbances that eventually drew the attention of one god in particular, who had a very specific and personal interest in the proper functioning of death. This was Ares, the god of war, whose entire domain and identity were built around conflict, violence, and the glory that came from triumph in battle, and who found the current situation intolerable for reasons that went beyond mere inconvenience to strike at the heart of his purpose. War without death, Ares quickly realized, was meaningless. The entire point of combat, The drama and intensity that made warfare the ultimate test of courage and skill depended on the stakes being absolute, on the possibility that any moment might be your last, that any mistake might mean the end. When warriors could not die, when battles produced nothing but endless suffering with no resolution through death, warfare lost its meaning and became merely an exercise in inflicting and receiving pain, without the catharsis of final victory or defeat. Ares was personally offended by this situation, viewing it as an attack on his domain and on everything he represented. He was also, unlike some of the other gods, not particularly interested in clever solutions or negotiated settlements. Ares was a god of direct action, of overwhelming force, and when he decided that Thanatos must be freed and Sisyphus must be punished for the chaos he had caused, he did not waste time with elaborate plans or subtle approaches. The god of war simply descended to Corinth in his full divine power, terrible and magnificent in his wrath, and he stormed into Sisyphus's palace with the kind of unstoppable momentum that no mortal defenses could hope to resist. Sisyphus, for all his cleverness, had no answer to direct divine intervention of this kind. He could trick an unsuspecting Thanatos who had approached him without particular caution, but he could not stand against a furious god who came prepared for resistance and who possessed the power to level entire cities if provoked.
Ares found Thanatos imprisoned in the chains and immediately freed him, breaking or unlocking the shackles that Sisyphus had used to bind the personification of death, restoring Thanatos to his proper function and allowing the natural order to reassert itself. The moment Thanatos was freed, the cosmic balance snapped back into place with effects that were felt throughout the world. Warriors who had been lingering in agonized limbo finally died from their wounds, their souls releasing at last to begin their journey to the underworld. Old people who had been trapped in failing bodies found the release they had been seeking. The animals and other living creatures that had been in states of injury or terminal illness completed their natural transitions. Death resumed his appointed rounds, collecting the souls that had accumulated during his imprisonment and restoring the proper rhythm of mortality. But Thanatos was not merely freed. He was angry, humiliated by his treatment at Sisyphus's hands, and determined to complete his original mission. And this time, he would not arrive alone or unprepared or susceptible to manipulation. Ares personally assisted in the capture of Sisyphus, ensuring that the clever king had no opportunity to employ more tricks or to escape through some unexpected avenue. Sisyphus was seized, bound in chains far stronger than those he had used on Thanatos, and dragged toward the underworld to face the judgment and punishment that Zeus had originally decreed. For most mortals, this would have been the end of the story, a humiliating defeat that proved the futility of resisting divine will and the consequences of hubris. But Sisyphus, even as he was being dragged in chains to his doom, was still thinking, still planning, still believing that his intelligence could find some escape route that his captors had overlooked. He had cheated death once through cleverness, and while that particular trick could not be repeated, he was confident that he could devise something new, some unexpected gambit that would give him another chance. And incredibly, improbably, Sisyphus did have one more trick prepared, one final scheme that he had set in motion before Ares arrived, a plan so audacious and so dependent on manipulating divine psychology that it should never have worked, but which somehow succeeded in earning him a second temporary escape from the fate that waited for him in the underworld. Part 5.
The trick that brought him back to life. Before Ares arrived to free Thanatos and capture Sisyphus, before the clever king found himself in chains being dragged toward the underworld, he had taken one final precautionary measure that demonstrated both his foresight and his complete lack of respect for any tradition or custom, even those surrounding death itself. He had given secret instructions to his wife, Merope, ordering her that when he died, she should not perform any of the traditional funeral rites that Greek custom demanded for the deceased. She should not wash his body, should not anoint it with oils, should not dress it in burial garments, should not place a coin in his mouth to pay Charon the ferryman, and most importantly, should not make the proper sacrifices and offerings to the gods of the underworld. This was a shocking and disturbing request, for failure to perform funeral rites properly was considered both deeply disrespectful to the deceased and potentially dangerous to the living, as improperly buried dead could become restless spirits that brought misfortune. But Merope, whether out of loyalty to her husband, or fear of his anger, or simply shared complicity in his schemes, agreed to follow his instructions. When Sisyphus arrived in the underworld, dragged there by Thanatos and Ares, and delivered to the realm of Hades and Persephone, who ruled over the dead, he immediately began complaining loudly about the disrespect and neglect he had suffered. He appeared before Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and launched into an elaborate and seemingly heartfelt tirade about how his wife had failed to honor him properly, how she had neglected all the traditional rites and ceremonies, how his body was lying unburied and unmourned in Corinth, while she presumably went about her life without appropriate grief or respect. He painted himself as a victim of spousal neglect and impiety, a man whose honor and dignity had been violated by a wife who apparently cared nothing for tradition or proper behavior. He claimed to be deeply hurt and offended by this treatment, and he begged Persephone for a chance to return temporarily to the world of the living so that he could confront his wife, demand that she perform the proper rites, and ensure that his memory would be honored as tradition demanded. This was a manipulation of extraordinary subtlety, for Sisyphus was playing on several aspects of divine psychology simultaneously.
He was presenting himself not as a clever schemer who deserved punishment, but as an aggrieved husband whose honor had been violated, shifting attention away from his crimes against the gods to focus on his wife's supposed crimes against him. He was appealing to Persephone's sense of proper order and tradition, suggesting that allowing him to return temporarily would actually serve the cause of maintaining appropriate customs around death and burial. And he was framing his request as temporary and limited, not asking for permanent release, but simply for a brief opportunity to correct an injustice before returning willingly to the underworld. Persephone, who had her own complicated history with death and the underworld, having been abducted by Hades and forced to spend part of each year in the realm of the dead, may have felt some sympathy for someone claiming to be wronged by circumstances surrounding death. Or perhaps she simply saw no particular harm in granting a temporary release to allow funeral rites to be properly performed, as this seemed to serve the interests of maintaining proper order and tradition. Whatever her reasoning, she agreed to Sisyphus's request, granting him permission to return temporarily to the world of the living, with the understanding that once he had resolved the issue with his wife, and ensured proper funeral rites were performed, he would willingly return to the underworld to take his place among the dead. The moment Sisyphus was released, the moment he found himself back in the world of the living with his mortal body restored and his freedom granted, he immediately broke his promise. He had absolutely no intention of returning to the underworld, had never intended to keep his word to Persephone, and had simply used the funeral rites as an excuse to manipulate his way back to life. Once free, he resumed his position as king of Corinth, openly mocking the gods who had been fooled by his trick, reveling in his second successful escape from death, and living his life with even more arrogance and hubris than before. He made no effort to hide his defiance, made no pretense of planning to eventually return to the underworld, but rather publicly celebrated his cleverness and his ability to outwit even the gods of death themselves. For a time, Sisyphus lived freely in Corinth, continuing his schemes and manipulations, growing even more convinced of his own superiority and invincibility. He had now cheated death twice, had made fools of Thanatos and Persephone, had disrupted the natural order and escaped punishment for it, and he seemed to have proven that intelligence truly was the supreme power in the universe, superior even to divine authority. But this victory, like his previous one, was temporary and built on the false assumption that the gods would simply accept being defeated and move on. The truth was that Sisyphus's continued defiance was building a debt that would eventually be collected, and when the gods finally decided they had tolerated enough of his arrogance and deception, the punishment they devised would be eternal, inescapable, and perfectly calibrated to torment the specific qualities that Sisyphus valued most about himself.
Part 6. Zeus's Final Judgment. The gods of Olympus watched Sisyphus living freely in Corinth, openly boasting about how he had tricked them, treating divine authority as a joke and the powers of the underworld as merely obstacles to be overcome through clever planning. For a time, they allowed this to continue, perhaps out of a sense that mortals should have some measure of free will, perhaps out of reluctance to escalate to measures that would leave no room for any future defiance by any mortal, or perhaps simply because even gods sometimes need time to formulate responses to unprecedented situations. But Sisyphus's continued mockery eventually pushed the divine patience beyond all reasonable limits. Zeus convened the council of the gods to discuss what should be done about the mortal who had now twice escaped death, who had imprisoned Thanatos, who had betrayed Zeus's secrets, and who showed absolutely no remorse or fear, but rather seemed to grow more arrogant with each successful trick. The discussion among the Olympians must have been heated, for Sisyphus's case raised fundamental questions about divine authority and cosmic order. If a mortal could repeatedly escape death through cleverness, if the natural boundaries between life and the underworld could be crossed and recrossed at will by someone smart enough to find the loopholes, what did that say about divine power? What kind of precedent would it set if Sisyphus was allowed to continue his defiance indefinitely? Other mortals, seeing that he had gotten away with his tricks, might be inspired to try their own schemes against the gods, and the entire system of divine authority and mortal submission that maintained order in the world might begin to break down. Zeus himself was particularly invested in seeing Sisyphus punished, both because the king of Corinth had personally betrayed his secrets, and because allowing this level of defiance to continue would undermine his authority as king of the gods. The judgment that Zeus ultimately pronounced was absolute and final. Sisyphus would be seized by force and dragged permanently into the underworld. And this time there would be no tricks, no temporary releases, no opportunities for manipulation or escape.
Hermes, the messenger god who also served as psychopomp, guiding souls to the underworld, was dispatched to collect Sisyphus, and he was given explicit instructions that no requests, no pleas, no clever arguments should be entertained. Sisyphus was to be treated not as someone who deserved explanation or negotiation, but simply as a condemned criminal being dragged to his punishment. When Hermes arrived in Corinth, Sisyphus tried one final time to employ his silver tongue, to find some argument or trick that might delay or avoid his fate. He argued that he had been promised temporary release and had simply interpreted that generously. He claimed that Persephone's instructions had been unclear and that any reasonable person would have understood them the way he had. He suggested that his cleverness was actually praiseworthy and that the gods should be impressed rather than angry. He offered to perform great services for the gods if they would allow him to remain alive. He pointed out that his rule had brought prosperity to Corinth and that removing him would harm innocent people. He tried every argument, every manipulation, every rhetorical trick he had developed over a lifetime of talking his way out of difficult situations. But Hermes was under strict orders and was immune to Sisyphus's manipulations, having been warned about all of his tactics and tricks. The gods simply seized Sisyphus and dragged him forcibly to the underworld, ignoring his protests and his clever arguments and his attempts to negotiate or delay. This time, when Sisyphus arrived in the realm of Hades, there was no hearing before Persephone, no opportunity to make requests or tell stories. He was taken directly to the deepest part of the underworld, to Tartarus, the pit where the worst offenders against divine authority were sent for punishment, the place where the Titans had been imprisoned after their defeat, where the most heinous criminals suffered torments designed specifically for their crimes. And there, in Tartarus, Zeus had prepared a punishment for Sisyphus that was perfect in its cruelty and its symbolism, a torture that would last forever and that would specifically target the qualities that Sisyphus had most valued in himself: his intelligence, his problem-solving ability, his refusal to accept defeat, and his belief that cleverness could overcome any obstacle.
Part 7. The Eternal Punishment. The boulder that can never reach the top. In the depths of Tartarus, where light itself seemed to struggle against the encompassing darkness, where the air was heavy with the weight of divine judgment and the echoes of eternal suffering, Sisyphus faced the punishment that would define his existence for all of eternity. Before him stood an enormous mountain, or steep hill, its slope rising at an angle that was just barely climbable, its surface rough and uneven. And at the base of this slope lay a massive boulder, a stone so large that it seemed impossible for any human to move it at all, let alone push it up the steep incline. But this was exactly what Sisyphus was condemned to do, and not just once, but forever, in a cycle that would repeat eternally, without end or variation. The task was deceptively simple in its description. Push the boulder to the top of the mountain. That was all. There was no elaborate maze to navigate, as there had been with the labyrinth, no monster to fight, as Heracles had faced, no complex riddle to solve, as the Sphinx had posed. Just a simple, straightforward physical task that required nothing but strength, endurance, and determination. Push the boulder up the slope, reach the summit, and presumably the task would be complete. But the simplicity was deceiving, for the punishment was designed with perfect understanding of what would torment Sisyphus most effectively. The boulder was exactly heavy enough that Sisyphus could move it, but only through exhausting effort that required him to push with all his strength, to strain every muscle, to focus all his energy and determination on the task. It was not so heavy that the task was obviously impossible from the start, which would have allowed Sisyphus to give up immediately and accept futility, but rather just possible enough that he could believe, each time he began, that this time he might actually succeed. The slope was steep enough to make the task genuinely difficult, requiring careful positioning and constant effort to prevent the boulder from sliding backward, but not so vertical that it was clearly impossible to climb. Every inch of progress required tremendous exertion, careful footwork, strategic planning about the best route to take, and absolute concentration to maintain balance and control of the massive stone. Sisyphus would begin at the base of the slope, position himself behind or beneath the boulder, and begin to push. His muscles would strain with the effort. His feet would scramble for purchase on the rough ground. His breath would come in ragged gasps as he forced the massive stone to move against gravity and its own tremendous weight. Slowly, agonizingly, he would make progress, pushing the boulder up the slope inch by inch, foot by foot. The higher he climbed, the more exhausted he became, his muscles burning with fatigue, his body screaming for rest. But he could not stop or even pause, because any relaxation of effort would allow the boulder to slide backward and undo his progress. He had to maintain constant forward momentum, constant upward pressure, or risk losing everything he had gained.
Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps he had finally found the right technique or the right angle of approach. Perhaps his determination and effort would be rewarded with success. The summit was right there, just a few more feet, just a little more effort, and he would reach it. But the punishment was designed with perfect cruelty. For the moment Sisyphus approached the top, the very instant before he could push the boulder over the summit and potentially complete his task, something would happen. The boulder would slip from his grasp, or it would become impossibly heavy for just a moment, or his footing would fail, or some other factor would intervene, and the massive stone would break free from his control. And then, with a sound like thunder, the boulder would roll backward down the slope, tumbling and crashing and gathering momentum, undoing in seconds all the progress that had taken hours or days of agonizing effort to achieve. The stone would crash back to the base of the slope, coming to rest in exactly the position where it had started, waiting for Sisyphus to begin again. And he would have no choice but to return to the bottom, to position himself once more behind the boulder, and to begin pushing again, starting the entire process over from the beginning. There was no escape from this cycle, no way to refuse the task or to find some clever alternative. The punishment was not optional, not something he could simply decline to participate in. Some force, whether divine compulsion or the nature of Tartarus itself, ensured that Sisyphus would continue pushing the boulder, that he would make the attempt again and again despite knowing that it would fail, that each successful push to near the summit would be followed by the crushing disappointment of watching the boulder roll back down. The physical suffering was intense, for the constant exertion without adequate rest would leave Sisyphus's body in perpetual agony, his muscles torn and exhausted, his hands raw from contact with the rough stone, his body bruised from the countless times the boulder had crashed against him, or knocked him down as it rolled backward. But the physical pain, severe as it was not really the point of the punishment, or at least not its most tormenting aspect. The true genius of this eternal torment lay in its psychological dimensions, in the way it was specifically designed to attack Sisyphus's sense of self and his core beliefs about intelligence and problem solving. Sisyphus had spent his entire life believing that every problem had a solution, that intelligence and careful analysis could overcome any obstacle, that giving up was simply a failure of imagination or determination. Now he was faced with a task that appeared solvable, that seemed like it should yield to effort and strategy, but which was actually impossible by design. Each time he pushed the boulder, he would analyze what had gone wrong the previous time, would adjust his approach, would try a slightly different angle or technique, convinced that he could find the solution that would finally allow him to succeed. And each time, despite his new strategy, despite his adjustments and innovations, the result would be the same. The boulder would roll back down, and he would be left to contemplate his failure and plan his next attempt. The hope was the worst part, for if the task had been obviously impossible from the start, Sisyphus might have been able to accept futility and exist in a state of resignation. But because success seemed tantalizingly possible, because each attempt felt like it might be the one that finally worked, he could never give up hope completely, could never stop believing that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. And so the disappointment when the boulder rolled back was fresh every time. The crushing realization that once again his effort had been wasted, that once again he had failed at what seemed like it should be achievable. The punishment forced Sisyphus to confront the limits of human agency and intelligence, to recognize that there were some situations where cleverness did not help, where determination was not enough, where the game was rigged from the start and no amount of strategic thinking could produce victory. For a man who had built his entire identity around being smarter than everyone else, around solving problems that others found impossible, this realization was devastating in ways that physical pain could never be. He was trapped not just in Tartarus, but in a task that mocked everything he valued about himself, that demonstrated every moment that his vaunted intelligence was useless, that proved repeatedly that sometimes there is no solution, no trick, no clever approach that can produce success. The boulder would not reach the top, not today, not tomorrow, not in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or in all of eternity. The task was impossible by divine decree, and no amount of human intelligence or determination could change that fundamental fact. And yet Sisyphus had to keep trying, had to keep pushing, had to continue the futile effort, knowing it was futile, experiencing the hope and the disappointment and the exhaustion in an endless cycle that had no variation and no escape. This was the punishment Zeus had devised for the man who thought he was smarter than the gods, and it was perfect in its cruelty, eternal in its duration, and absolutely inescapable.
Part 8. Legacy of Sisyphus. What his story really means. The myth of Sisyphus has resonated through more than 2 millennia of human culture, evolving from an ancient Greek cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris into a profound philosophical symbol that speaks to fundamental questions about human existence, meaning, and the struggle against futility. The image of the man pushing the boulder up the mountain, only to watch it roll back down, has become one of the most recognizable and powerful metaphors in Western culture, appearing in everything from existentialist philosophy to popular culture, from academic discourse to everyday conversation about frustrating and repetitive tasks. At its most basic level, the story serves the purpose that most Greek myths about divine punishment served:
It demonstrates the consequences of hubris and the futility of challenging divine authority. Sisyphus believed he was clever enough to outwit the gods, to manipulate even death itself, and his punishment showed definitively that such arrogance leads to destruction. The Greeks who heard this story would have understood it as a warning about the proper boundaries between mortal and divine, about the danger of allowing success and intelligence to convince you that you are exempt from the rules that govern ordinary mortals, and about the ultimate superiority of divine power over human cleverness. No matter how smart you think you are, no matter how many times you have successfully manipulated situations to your advantage, the gods will always win in the end, and the punishment for thinking otherwise will be severe and eternal. This reading of the myth emphasizes divine justice and the maintenance of cosmic order, suggesting that Sisyphus got exactly what he deserved for his crimes, and that his eternal suffering serves both as punishment and as a warning to others who might be tempted to similar acts of hubris. But, as the myth has been interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries, particularly by modern philosophers and writers, it has taken on layers of meaning that go far beyond simple moral instruction about respecting the gods. The French existentialist philosopher Albert Camus wrote an entire philosophical essay titled The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he used the story as a starting point for exploring questions about meaning, absurdity, and how humans should respond to a universe that seems fundamentally meaningless. Camus saw Sisyphus not primarily as a criminal being justly punished, but rather as a symbol of the human condition itself, arguing that all of us are essentially pushing boulders up mountains that will inevitably roll back down, engaging in tasks and projects that will ultimately come to nothing, living lives that, from a cosmic perspective, seem futile and absurd. We work jobs that feel meaningless. We build things that will eventually decay. We form relationships that will end in death. We pursue goals that, once achieved, often feel empty. And we do all of this knowing that eventually we ourselves will die, and whatever we have accomplished will be forgotten. In this reading, Sisyphus's punishment is not unique, but rather is simply a more vivid and dramatic version of what all humans experience: the fundamental absurdity of existence in a universe that offers no inherent meaning or purpose. But Camus did not see this as a reason for despair. Instead, he argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that in the moment when he walks back down the mountain to begin pushing the boulder again, he achieves a kind of consciousness and defiance that makes him superior to his punishment. Sisyphus knows his task is futile, knows the boulder will roll back down, but he pushes it anyway, choosing to engage fully with his fate rather than succumbing to despair or refusing to participate.
This act of conscious defiance in the face of absurdity, this decision to push the boulder despite knowing it is ultimately pointless, represents for Camus the only authentic response to the human condition. We must acknowledge the absurdity of existence while simultaneously choosing to live fully and engage with our tasks and relationships despite their ultimate futility. This interpretation transforms Sisyphus from a cautionary tale about hubris into an inspirational story about human dignity and the courage to persist in the face of meaninglessness. Other interpretations have focused on different aspects of the myth and drawn different lessons from it. Some see Sisyphus's punishment as a meditation on the nature of habit and routine, the way that much of human life consists of repetitive tasks that must be performed again and again without any final completion. We clean our houses only to have them get dirty again. We eat meals only to become hungry again. We sleep only to wake up tired again. And much of work consists of tasks that must be repeated daily or weekly with no sense of permanent accomplishment. The myth in this reading asks us to consider how we find meaning and satisfaction in such repetitive activities, how we avoid being crushed by the sense of futility that could accompany the recognition that so much of what we do will simply need to be done again. Some readers have focused on the theme of punishment and whether eternal torment can ever be just, using Sisyphus as a starting point for discussions about the nature of justice, proportionality in punishment, and whether any crime, no matter how severe, can truly deserve infinite suffering. The fact that Sisyphus's crimes were serious but not genocidal, that he killed no one and caused suffering primarily through deception and manipulation, makes his eternal punishment seem potentially excessive, raising questions about divine justice and whether the god's response was truly proportional to his offenses. Other interpretations have emphasized the theme of rebellion and resistance, seeing Sisyphus as a proto-revolutionary figure who refused to accept the limitations imposed upon him by authority, who fought against death itself, and who maintained his defiance even in the face of overwhelming power. In this reading, his punishment demonstrates not the futility of resistance, but rather the courage required to resist despite the costs, and his eternal labor becomes a symbol of the ongoing human struggle against oppression and limitation. The myth has also been used in more mundane contexts to describe frustrating situations in everyday life, giving us the adjective Sisyphean to describe tasks that seem endless and futile, that must be repeated constantly without ever being truly completed, or that involve enormous effort for minimal lasting result. When someone describes their work as Sisyphean, they are invoking this ancient myth to express a very modern feeling of frustration with repetitive, seemingly meaningless labor. The enduring power of the Sisyphus myth lies in its openness to multiple interpretations, its ability to speak to different concerns and questions depending on the context in which it is read. It can be a story about divine punishment for hubris, a meditation on the absurdity of existence, a reflection on the nature of repetitive labor, a question about justice and proportionality, a symbol of human resistance and dignity, or simply a vivid image that captures the feeling of frustration we all experience when our efforts seem wasted. The figure of Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the mountain has become one of those rare mythological images that transcends its original context to become a universal symbol, recognizable even to people who know nothing else about Greek mythology, capable of conveying complex ideas about meaning, effort, and futility in a single, vivid picture. What the myth ultimately teaches us may depend on what questions we bring to it, but certain themes emerge consistently across different readings. The story reminds us of the limits of human power and intelligence, the danger of hubris and the belief that we can manipulate or control forces larger than ourselves, the psychological torment of hope repeatedly disappointed, and the question of how we find meaning and maintain dignity when engaged in tasks that seem futile or when facing situations we cannot change. Whether we see Sisyphus as a villain receiving just punishment, or as a tragic figure symbolizing the human condition, whether we imagine him crushed by despair or defiantly happy in his eternal task, the image of the man and his boulder continues to speak to something fundamental about human experience, about the struggle to find meaning and purpose in a universe that often seems indifferent to our efforts, and about the question of how we should respond when faced with tasks that seem impossible or pointless, but which we must nevertheless attempt. The legacy of Sisyphus is that his name and his punishment have outlasted the civilization that created them, that thousands of years after the ancient Greeks told his story around fires and in theaters, we still invoke his image when we want to express ideas about futility, perseverance, absurdity, or the eternal human struggle to push our boulders up our mountains, knowing they will roll back down, but pushing anyway, because that is what it means to be human, to engage with our tasks and our fates, despite their ultimate futility, to maintain our dignity and our effort, even in the face of eternal frustration and disappointment.
And that's it with the story about Sisyphus.
I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like and consider subscribing for more mythology stories. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.